I beat a guy to death one time. I had blood in my shoes. His blood in my shoes. It just goes on that way. Had to throw all my clothes away. Here I was driving a big Lincoln Town car with butt naked. Had a sheet wrapped around me. We're having too much fun. You know that? You realize that? I'm coming across like a nice guy.
Hi, my name is Madison, and you are listening to or watching Who's Knocking? Yet another true crime podcast. Hey, everybody, and welcome. If you're new here, this is a part 3, so please go back to part 1. And we are doing part 3 of my what will be 4 parts, actually, on Richard Kuklinski, aka the Iceman Killer. So as I said, if you have not seen part 1 or part 2, I would highly suggest you go back and start at the beginning. Duh. I was just off for a week because I was potty training my nearly 3-year-old son. I won't give you any of the grisly details because that's not what you're here for, but I am glad that's over, but still kind of happening. If you're new, I would really appreciate if you would subscribe to this channel, or if you're on audio only, if you would leave a comment or a rating or what have you. If you're enjoying things, that would be dope. Also, if you're interested in my weekly true crime newsletter, go to grimweekly.com. That's GRIM weekly.com. You can see archived issues there. And you can subscribe for free to that newsletter that comes out on Fridays. It's fun. It's hip. It's not hip. Nothing I do is hip. But it is fun. And I have a lot of, I don't have a lot of people who subscribe to it, I will be honest, but the people who do subscribe to it are fun, and they email me, and it's wonderful and gruesome. So without further ado, I think I will get into it. I will just say also, before we do get into it, there are some clips that I've used from the Iceman Confessions HBO series, and some of them have some very graphic images. I'm talking about dead bodies, so just be warned if that's something that bothers you. If you're on audio, you don't have to worry about it, but if you're here, probably you're fine with it. First 2 episodes we talked about, this is going in like pretty much chronological order, so we started with Richard's childhood, his abusive family, and his version of what occurred as a child, his first murders, many other murders that he says he committed. Then in episode 2, we meet Barbara, who Richard dated and then married, and their journey to have children. They have 3 children, Merrick, Kristen, and the son, Dwayne. I will say in that episode, I did say like, oh, Dwayne, he's not really mentioned very much at all. I don't know why that is. Turns out it was kind of what I was thinking, but he's quite a bit younger than the sisters. And Richard had this weird thing, which is not shocking given his entire personality, but he never really wanted a son because he knew and did become jealous of the son because he wanted all of Barbara's attention. He did not want any male attention competing with him, any males competing with him for attention, Barbara's attention. It's just interesting because she just says she did not like him at all. And he, like, there did become a time where he, like, felt tension between him and Dwayne. And so Barbara and the sisters all really tried to shelter Dwayne from all of Richard's behavior and, like, hide the fact that he was abusive physically towards Barbara and psychologically toward the daughters. And eventually there did come a time where Dwayne realized what was going on and he did not like it. And yeah, there's this like very weird dynamic going on there, but checks out. That's the recap. That's that. And here we go. The word mafia has been expanded to this day to refer to any body of organized crime. And today, many groups fall under that category. But the mafia that we will refer to in this story is the Italian American mafia. The OGs, if you will. I guess the OGs would be the Sicilian mafia, which there are all kinds of Italian mafias as well. But the mafia in which we're speaking about has become a pretty huge phenomena in pop culture. Goodfellas, The Godfather, The Sopranos, these are just some of the major iconic works that kind of give you a peek into the world of the mafia. It is a fascinating, dark, violent culture with its own hierarchies, laws, moral code. And this is the world that our boy Richard claimed to be very deeply involved in. So that's what we're going to be diving into a lot today. Now, question 2 to all of you true crime connoisseurs, do you consider organized crime to be a part of the true crime genre? I mean, I kind of think you have to because it's crime and it is true. But to me, I've always thought of like organized crime, mafia, etc., to be kind of like its own little subgenre. And I think it is its own subgenre, of course. But I guess to me, like how I really, like what I'm interested in true crime is the motivation behind it, the psychology of it. When it comes to like serial killers, cults, just like random, regular murders, if you will, it's always the psychology and the motivation that is the interesting part to me. That's what I want to know. It's like if somebody is murdered, I want to know who did it and why they did it. That is what's most interesting to me. Whereas I feel like with everything I just mentioned before, it's often like interpersonal relationships or something often in the psyche or whatever. Organized crime to me always seemed like the motivation for all the violence was purely money. And I think for a lot of it, a vast majority of it is probably true, but I think especially in this story, you'll see there's a couple characters that like they happen to be in the mafia, and maybe because of what they're surrounded with, they have the ability to kind of express it more, but seem to be psychologically unwell or have very warped motivations or what have you. It seems to me like there's a pretty big crossover. So I found that super interesting. And I'm just wondering, like, are you guys as interested in organized crime? Like, I guess, would it be considered white collar crime? I don't even know. I don't know. Are you interested in organized crime stuff as much as you are true crime, or like do you consider it different? What do you think? I'm fascinated to hear people's opinions on that. So the mafia, specifically the Italian mafia, which will then become the American mafia as well, has a long history which began in Sicily, Italy in the 19th century. The very tumultuous nature of Italian politics at the time kind of allowed the mafia to thrive after its origin and even after Mussolini's very harsh crackdowns on organized crime. The history is very long and very interesting. I highly suggest you go out and do some research if that interests you. But for the purposes of this episode, I won't go too far down that rabbit hole, but I will begin in America, where the mafia rose to prominence in the 1920s during the Prohibition era. You see, alcohol being made illegal created the kind of perfect environment for a new black market, and the Italian mafia stepped in to claim that industry. It's funny how that always seems to go that way. And when the Prohibition ended, the mafia got involved in lots of other criminal activities, such as drug trafficking, gambling, prostitution, and they also kind of shimmied their way into some more legitimate enterprises. They got involved in labor unions and construction businesses, and they made a lot of money and caused a lot of violence. And I don't know that this is true, but I would have to assume if you are like, a criminal enterprise and you want to get into construction, for example, being able to, do the task or have the business legitimately is one thing. But if you're going to be so ruthless that you become violent whenever you don't get your way, and you are, for whatever reason, able to continue doing that, probably because people are afraid of you, like, you're going to kill that industry because you're just going to crack a few skulls to get there. So it's interesting how they also got into some legitimate things and then kind of took it over. Like, even I think I live in Toronto, and there's still, I wouldn't say it's mafia, but like there's some families, like construction businesses and stuff, like you don't cross them. Like, you don't get to encroach on their territory. So that kind of I guess territory taking still happens a lot. The mafia, as it pertains to our story, are essentially groups of families, or what they're called, and they, as a family, participate in organized crime. Now, in the American Mafia, there are 5 families. You have the Bonanno family, the Colombo family, the Gambino family, the Genovese family, and the Lucchese family. I believe that Goodfellas is based on the Lucchese's, pretty sure. There's also, and this is fascinating, I did not know this at all, but there is this like board type committee known as the Commission, who establish rules and regulations that all mafia families must adhere to, and they act as this kind of like supreme court to the mafia, which is super official. And so it's like it's a legit organized crime. Like, it is organized, it's super organized, which is I just like, it's so interesting. So within each family structure, it works basically like this. At the top of the food chain, you have the boss, and he is the boss. He makes decisions, and he is in charge of everything. He generally tries to remain as far away from the media or the police radar as possible. He kind of sits behind the scenes and doesn't want to be known to people. His assistant, or like to the side, not above or below him, is a consigliere. And this is a guy who is essentially an advisor to the boss. He's supposed to act as an impartial decision maker and does not get involved in the business end of things. Think of him as the assistant to the regional manager, if you will. And under the boss, you have the underboss. He is the second in command, and he's kind of the face of the boss. He speaks to the lower level guys, and he tells them whatever the boss tells him to do. He would be the one to, speak on behalf of the family or on behalf of the boss. And also, through this entire thing, like, the money's all going up. So like, the boss is the one to get all the money and decide where it all goes. And you kind of have to consider the boss and the underboss, I believe, as like kind of one unit. But the boss is like the brain of the unit, whereas the underboss is like the mouth of the unit. Below those guys are the capo regime. I don't know how to pronounce that. We'll call them capos. These are the captains of the crews of soldiers. They can be there can be multiple capos per family depending on the size, and they work within specified regions. So the capos each get like a territory, and that's where they and their crew work. I sound like such a loser saying this so like nerdily, but okay, whatever. That's who I am. Anyway, the capos, they get to keep some of the earnings, but most of the money gets sent up to the bosses. Below the capos, as I mentioned, are their workers, who they call soldiers. These are common criminal types. They do all the dirty work. They don't really get to keep much or any of the money, and they make up most of the like collateral damage and the people who go to prison. It's essentially, I believe, like kind of where you start. I believe that if you're on that level, it's like your goal is to kind of move up the hierarchy, I assume. And then, of course, there are the associates. These are non-mafia connected individuals who work with or for the mob, but for whatever reason are not mob members. To become a mafia member, you must be full-blooded Italian, and you must be officially inducted into the family, i.e. you must be made. The process of becoming a mafia member is the process of being made. Sorry. I know how lame I sound, and I'm okay with it. Now, our boy Richard, he was considered an associate, for he was not Italian and could never be made. He says that at some point or another, he did contracts for all the families, and that one of the perks of not being in a specific family was that you could kind of have your hand in every pie. The downside was that you did not get the protection that the made men got, right? Like, it was a big deal to hit, i.e. kill, a made man. If you killed a made man for any reason, there would be consequences to that. If you killed a random associate, who cares? Maybe his family, I don't know, but nobody in the mafia. One of Richard's more involved mafia relationships, according to Richard, was a man named Roy Domeo, who eventually became a member of the Gambino family. Now, Roy was a pretty freaky individual. He definitely deserves his own episode. He was something, I'll tell you that. And if anybody's interested in that, let me know, because I'll do it. I will. He was a scrappy guy. He came from a kind of nothing, nobody life. And basically, he became a loan shark when he was younger. So if you don't know what a loan shark is, he would loan money to people at very high interest rates. And when people did not pay back his money on time, he would hurt them. So he did very well doing that. He kind of forced his way into the Gambino family. At first, he was working mostly as a hitman. I think he was working for another family at first. But this man, he killed a lot of people. He was a successful hitman. It's interesting. I feel like some people like, arguably he's more like a way crazier person than Richard. But we'll get to that. Roy has been associated with this very horrific place called the Gemini Lounge, which was in Brooklyn. Now, the Gemini Lounge was a place that a lot of Roy's crew, like he had this crew of guys, they would hang out, and these guys were known as the Domeo crew. And at some point, this place became the place where they would kill and dispose of bodies that they had hit or killed for whatever reason. Estimates now place the amount of people that Roy killed between 75 and 200 people. And their murders were often absolutely brutal. And you see, Roy had once worked as a butcher's apprentice, and he was pretty good at butchering, or in this case, dismembering human bodies. Roy devised and trained his crew of guys on a very specific way to kill and dispose of bodies, which would later become known as the Gemini method. And the Gemini method went a little something like this. The Mark would be invited to the lounge for whatever reason, either to hang out or for business reasons, and he would be shot in the head at a very close range by one guy, and immediately after, another guy would wrap a towel around the wound to keep the blood spill to a minimum. I read in some places, but not all, that then a third guy would then immediately stab the person in the heart to stop the blood from pumping entirely. And that way, that was all done to like minimize the mess. Then this person would be beheaded and dismembered into many smaller pieces. All of the parts were then wrapped up in plastic bags like meat and then thrown into a dump or probably various other disposal ways or whatever. The Gemini Lounge had a nickname, and that nickname was the Body Factory. Just take that in for a second. Richard met Domeo when Domeo came to collect some money on a debt that Richard had, but Richard didn't have the money yet, and he gave Roy some attitude, not really knowing who exactly Roy was. Roy ended up pulling a gun on Richard and roughing him up a little, which was a very rare occurrence for Richard, and he did not like it. Later, when he found out who Roy was and he went to confront him, Richard ended up taking kind of a liking to Richard. He thought that it was really respectable the way that when Roy came and went to beat up Richard didn't, it's like he kind of took it. And from Richard's perspective, he was like, okay, well, I'm not going to just murder you here. I don't like you because you're doing this, and I'm going to come back and murder you later. whereas Roy kind of took it as like a sign of respect. That's what I got from Richard's retelling of this. It's a little weird though. In the end, Roy started taking a liking to Richard, where Richard thought that he could definitely make money with Roy Domeo, but he says he always had in the back of his mind that he would intend to kill Roy because he hated Roy because he was crazy. Once they decided to start working together, and Roy was like, yeah, look, I'll take you on as a hitman. I have tons of work that you can do. Richard was like, yeah, sure, that's cool. So Roy took Richard out to Manhattan to, I guess, give him an initiation. So they were driving around and he like picked out a random guy on the street who was like walking a dog, and he's like, Richard, kill that man. And so Richard killed that man. He shot him. He, I think, had a silencer, so it was just done, and the man fell to the ground, became another unsolved New York City homicide. Roy and Richard also worked together in the porn industry, or the porn stuff that Richard was doing, pirating porn, distributing it. The Gambino family were, I think I mentioned this before, huge clients of Richard's. They sold a lot of porn. Porn was really big in those days when it was all done via videotape. So as that business was expanding, Richard also purchased a warehouse that he used to keep, buy and sell stolen, pirated, or fake designer things as well. He had a lot of like random illegal businesses going in that sense, as well as being a hitman. So life was good. He had a bunch of money and he used it to spoil the shit out of his family. And as he started working for Roy, there was a lot more hit jobs coming up. So like a lot of money was piling up. He made good money for each hit. So Richard got himself a nice new Cadillac. He got a new, nicer home in more of the like suburb, I guess, area of New Jersey. Barbara knew not to ask Richard any questions about where all of this money came from. She seemed to have no problem spending the money. Fair enough. Her life sucked. But she figured that whatever he was doing was probably illegal, but she knew that if she prodded and asked him where it came from, like, he was not going to answer, and probably he was going to hurt her. So here she is.
I never questioned him, and you just knew, don't do it. Don't ask. If he got up at 2 o'clock in the morning or during dinner and put on his shoes and walked out the door, you said bye. You didn't say, where are you going or why are you going? And it was just understood that that's the way it was. He was very private. You only knew what he wanted you to know.
So Richard and Roy were working together a lot, but Richard says that he did not really get involved in any of the stuff at the Gemini Lounge. You see, Richard was a very efficient killer, according to him, and he was very good at it. And these guys clearly did a lot of that stuff, but Richard was very put off by them. Not because he was like disgusted in the way that a regular person would be, or not that he felt any sort of moral offense, but he just thought that they were all very sloppy and impulsive. There's a lot of stories where, like, there's just one story where, like, Richard was out on a boat with a bunch of the guys, and like one of them said something to annoy Roy, so he just like shot him and like pushed him out of the boat and fed him to sharks. And like, it's just like they did impulsive shit like that. So he just didn't think it was like safe to be around them because he thought the likelihood that they would get caught for something was not good. And like, these are all mafia guys who are more connected than Richard is. Richard is just an associate. So Richard preferred to work on his own. Most of his hits were very simple. He'd get a photo, some info, he'd find the mark, he'd take him out. That's it. Richard knew of these old abandoned mine shafts out in Pennsylvania, and sometimes he would drive bodies out there and toss them down where they would never be found. He had a lot of tricks like that, and a lot of the times he would also just drop bodies and leave them be, knowing that they would never be tied to him, or that their death would be misidentified as some other cause of death, like a suicide or something. I'll give you a few examples from Philip Carlo's book, aka The Mouth of Richard, apparently. And here's just a little taste of the way Richard conducts his business. Quote, a man in Brooklyn owed the Bonanno family $140,000. Instead of paying, he figured he'd go to the feds and talk, get the people he owed money to arrested. Not a good idea. He had a garage. Richard was called there. The people who were owed the money were also there waiting. They waited to see it done, a skipper and 4 associates. Richard was given the nod. He knocked the guy down and with a pistol, equipped with a silencer, shot him in the arms, elbows, and knees. Then in the genitals, drawing out the death for his customers to see and know and enjoy. After shooting him 7 times, Richard tortured him with a knife and then finally slit his throat. Everyone was happy. Richard received 25 large. He liked to please his customers. A guy in Tennessee owed money and would not pay. He had been given porn by the Gambinos and thumbed his nose at them, told his friends, "I ain't paying, fuck 'em." Richard was sent to see him. He gave Richard checks that proved to be worthless. Richard threw him out a window 8 stories down. I think typically you can survive from a 5-story height, but 8 is a little much. A big, heavy guy who was thought to be talking to the cops got into his car and drove off, listening to music as he went. Richard followed him on a motorcycle. He had a cut-down double-barrel shotgun with him, hidden in his leather jacket. The mark stopped at a red light. He began to light a fat cigar, looked at the large biker who had just pulled up next to him. He didn't give him a second thought. A moment later, Richard pulled out the shotgun and let loose both barrels, holding it with his enormous hand, completely taking off the mark's head. The light turned green. The motorcycle pulled away slowly, not in any hurry. No witnesses, no connection to Richard. An Asian man in Honolulu also owed money, wouldn't pay. He made excuses. He thought he was above reprisal. Richard was dispatched. His orders were get the money or make him dead. Richard met him in his room in a very expensive 5-star hotel. No money. Plenty of lame excuses. Richard was fawning and excessively polite. They moved out on the terrace. "What a nice view," said Richard, looking out at the wonderful vista. Yes, it's lovely," said the Asian man. And before he knew it, he was plummeting to the ground. A big, bloody, meaty thud, broken bones, smashed beyond recognition or repair. Richard calmly turned and left. Whenever he killed, he never hurried. The killing was thought of as a suicide by authorities, as Richard knew it would be, he says. End quote. But sometimes these jobs came with requests to make the mark suffer. Take it away, Rich.
I've had requests where the guy wanted the guy's tongue cut out. And he also wanted his tongue put in his rear end. So I believe there was a definite point he wanted to get across.
There was one instance in Philip Carlo's book where Richard recalled a time, and this is all Richard's words. He'd recalled a time where he'd been sent to Florida to kill a man who he'd been told raped the 14-year-old daughter of some mafia guy. And the way Richard says that he killed this man was disgusting and so horrific. And I'm going to tell you about it now. You've been warned, it's disgusting and horrific. So he says he found this guy, knocked him out, and put him in the trunk of his car. And then he drove him in the middle of the night to this beach that was secluded and nobody was there. And he began by yanking this man's scrotum from his body with his bare hands. Just grabbing the balls and pulling them off. I do not have a scrotum, but I can feel that. Then he cut the man's penis off with a knife. Then he sliced off chunks of this man's flesh, and I disemboweled him a little bit, not to the point where he died, just to the point where some of his intestines were coming out. And then he rubbed salt in the man's wounds. Then he put a life jacket on him to prevent him from drowning and tossed him and all of his dismembered parts into the ocean, hoping that sharks would finish him off. The one thing he did keep was the penis, and he put that in a little plastic bag and brought it back as proof of the torture. So that's one way he killed someone. Remember, Richard says he really didn't like rapists, so he did that. And this is one of the most discussed methods of killing that Richard has talked about. And this was what he would do in the event that there was a torture request.
I used to have a thing where I would take somebody into a cabin or cave, whatever you want to call it, and I would tie them up or tape them, their hands and their feet together, and then I would leave them there, and I'd leave a camera on. And rats used to eat them. Rats used to kill these people. It was a very painful death for these people because rats would eventually smell them or come near them and start nibbling away at them. The people would definitely scream and yell and holler and try to get away. And eventually more rats would come, and they would consume these people eventually, you know. But there was a lot of screaming and yelling in between. But when I did that and I watched it on The Devil Was That, Super 8, I think it was, I found it distasteful, and it used to make me nervous for some reason. And so that was some type of a feeling which I wasn't too keen on having. But I did it because it gave me a feeling of some kind, and therefore I was trying to find out what it was that was giving me some type of feeling. Whether it was the horror of what was going on, or the screaming that was happening, or just the nastiness of it. But I never figured it out. But I did that quite a few times, too. Maybe too many times.
Now, one of the reasons that Richard claimed he was able to get away with so much murdering without ever being implicated or falling under the radar of police was that he steered very clear of any mob-related activity. Few people that he worked for actually knew his real name or had direct access to him. He did not mingle with or socialize with these people. His family never met them or came in contact with any of these people. Richard kept his family life and his work life completely separate, which is very different from the Mafia. In the Mafia, I mean, I think these guys keep secrets from their wives and they have their gumas or whatever, but like it's very much family and business mixed. Like the business is the family is the business. It was pretty easy, I think, for the police to like track down who were Mafia guys, who weren't, who ran with who. Like they were able to make these big, picture graphs with all these guys and know who was in what family and everything, because these guys were completely involved with each other and spent every day and every minute of every day with each other. Whereas Richard kept on the periphery and liked it that way, specifically so that he would not be able to be identified. Okay, so Richard has made a lot of claims about his involvement in the Mafia, and there are a number of Mafia-related hits that Richard claimed to have been a part of in this book, in the Iceman Confessions, etc. So I'm going to take you through a bunch of those events, claims that we know did happen. We know these people were killed, but a lot of these kills have been documented as being done by other people, and now Richard came around after the fact claiming that he was a part of them. So these are not necessarily in chronological order, but regardless, here we go. So there was a man named Paul Rothenberg. Richard claimed that he was the actual guy who killed Paul Rothenberg, which was in a kind of like strip mall parking lot. He claimed that he did it in front of Roy Domeo, that Roy had asked him to kill Paul Rothenberg, and that this weird scenario happened where he said he was going to kill him, and Roy was like, wait a minute, wait till I get there, and then you can kill him in front of me, which is very, very weird. This hit Roy ordered Richard to do. Paul was a big guy in the porn scene. He was a big porn producer, and they wanted Paul dead because the police had raided Paul's business situation, and they were trying to like lean on all those guys in order to get information about the Mafia, which was their real main concern. So they wanted to kill Paul so that he wouldn't rat on them, essentially. Nino Gaggi ordered Roy Domeo to hit Paul, and Roy asked Richard to do it. That's what the claim is. Nino, by the way, was a big name in the Gambino family. Then there was a man named Bruno Latini, and he was the brother of Gambino captain Eddie Lino. He owed Richard money and he wasn't paying it back, and eventually he stopped answering Richard's calls, so Richard then later found Latini sitting in his car and shot him in the head with a .38. The police found Latini and never linked him to Richard. Then there was a man named Paul Castellano, and he had been appointed as head of the Gambino family in 1976 after his successor, his brother-in-law Carlo Gambino, passed away. Paul was not a very good mob boss, apparently. He did not come from the streets. He came from the upper echelons of the Mafia. So a lot of the lower level captains apparently did not respect him. And he was also kind of a greedy bastard, which is a lot to say for somebody already in the Mafia, because they're all kind of greedy bastards, depending on who you ask. This resentment apparently led to the murder of Paul and his bodyguard, Tony Bellotti, outside of Sparks Steakhouse in December of 1985. And the men who ordered that hit, or those hits, were John Gotti and Sammy the Bull Gravano. And Richard claims that he was one of the team of hitmen to murder Paul and Tony. Then there was the murder of Jimmy Hoffa, which is a big one. In July of 1975, Richard and 3 others were sent to Detroit to hit Jimmy Hoffa. So Jimmy, he was an American union leader who was the president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Jimmy was known to have had mob connections and had been convicted on a number of counts related to organized crime. Jimmy had been sentenced to a 13-year prison sentence in 1967, but he was out by 71 when then President Richard Nixon commuted his sentence to time served. And that was a very controversial political issue that got very messy. Again, I won't go too far into that. It's its own very interesting scenario, but we just simply don't have the time. The bottom line is that as a condition of his reduced sentence, he was not supposed to be allowed to be involved in any more union stuff, but he wanted to be involved in more union stuff. And so he tried to be involved in union stuff. And so Jimmy Hoffa was like a very schemy, disagreeable fella. And I guess he did okay for a few years, but then by 1975, he'd upset some of his fellow businessmen, and he had been bragging too vigorously about how little he feared them, and they decided that it was time for Jimmy to go. So the hit was ordered by a guy named Russi Buffalino, who at the time was the temporary head of the Genovese family. And Richard and the boys drove from Union City, New Jersey to Detroit. They killed Jimmy Hoffa. Richard claims that he was the one to do the actual stab that killed Jimmy. And then they stashed his body in a bag, threw him in the trunk of a car, and Richard was the one to drive with the body in the trunk alone all the way back to New Jersey, which is risky biz, if you ask me. So Richard drove the body to a mob-owned junkyard. where it was placed in a 55-gallon drum, covered in gasoline, lit on fire, and then buried. Richard went home with $40,000 for that job. Later, however, as things got a little bit more contentious and they feared, I think somebody who was involved started speaking to the police or something, like they were like, this is no longer safe to have him buried there. The drum was then dug up, placed in the trunk of a car, and smashed down into a 4x4 cube, and then shipped off to Japan to be used as scrap metal. So somebody is out here driving a Mitsubishi with little bits of Jimmy Hoffa in the walls. Elephant in the room. These claims have been heavily criticized, and pretty much all of these hits, as I said, have been documented to have been done by people who are not Richard Kuklinski. Richard, I think, will say, for all the reasons that I've said in these last few episodes, I was so good at being a hitman, at covering up my tracks, at not letting anybody know who I was, that like I was involved in all these things, but everybody knew to keep their mouth shut, or like nobody knew who I was. And we will speak to all of those claims. That is what I'm most excited about. That's going to be next episode. I think I said earlier that it was going to be episode 3, but I didn't know that it was going to be a 4-parter, but here we are. The part that I will now go into is probably considered some of the most credible of the claims. These are the murders and crimes that we actually have evidence for. And I think it's interesting because you'll probably pick up on in this episode, like it's quite a different, the crimes are very different. The ones, all the Mafia hits and everything versus what we're going to get into now, they could be like two completely different guys, which is where I think people started to be like, So just, pay attention to the differences between these crimes that I'm about to talk to versus the ones that I just spoke about. So to start, Richard had a friend named George Maliband. Now, George was a very large fella, probably sitting at about 300 pounds. And Richard was sitting at close to 300 pounds, but he was a lot taller, so he seemed more like a strong guy. I think this George guy was more of just a chubby fella. He was a loud guy. He was a gambler. He gambled a lot, and he had a big mouth. Richard had met him through another man named Phil Solimini, who we'll get into in a little bit. Now, George was a criminal type, but he was not Mafia, and Richard said that he took a real liking to this guy. He would go on fishing trips with George. He had introduced his family to George as his business associate, but he left out that the business was porn and murder. So yeah, he was in tight with Richard, and Richard actually says he was a friend of his, which he didn't have a lot of friends. Now one day, Maliband got himself into some pretty deep gambling debts. He was indebted to a bunch of guys who were now trying to get their money back, and so he went to his friend Richard for help. Richard introduced George to Roy Domeo, who was still a loan shark, and Roy lent him some money. And that solves one problem, but now George owed Roy Domeo money, and that was another problem. And when the time came for him to pay up, he didn't have the money. So George went back to Richard and tried to get him to talk to Domeo. And at first, Richard did talk to Roy, and he got him to give George an extra week. But that one extra week came, and that one extra week went, and George still did not have the money. And that was essentially the end of George. So Richard had said that George, he'd kind of started threatening Richard. He just very casually said to Richard, I know you're going to help me because I know where you live. And that was enough for Richard. He took out a gun and he shot Maliband 5 times because nobody was going to threaten Richard's children and live to tell the tale. This was a bit of a mess, and it was an unexpected situation. There was a lot of blood. So Richard took George's body to the warehouse that he rented, and he tried to shove George's body into a big 55-gallon drum, but George didn't fit because he was so big. So Richard had to chop off one of his legs. in order to like shove it in the barrel and get it all in there. Richard then took the barrel out to this big chemical plant dump site in Jersey City, and he tossed the barrel down this very steep embankment. But what Richard was unaware of was that when it got to the bottom, the lid popped off, probably because there was so much inside, and the severed leg spilled out, and it wasn't long before the body was discovered and identified. Now, this was very sloppy of Richard, because after George was identified, Richard was questioned about the murder, and this was the first time he'd ever been questioned about a murder, and he did not like that. So he vowed that he, needed to get himself together and not be so impulsive, because he knew that that would lead to police involvement. So that was the murder of George Maliband. Now, here's another situation, or like series of situations that we do have evidence for. So Richard set up a phony business deal with a man named Paul Hoffman. Now, Paul was a pharmacist who was looking to purchase a drug called Tagamin, which was used to treat ulcers at the time. Now, side note, Hoffman had sold cyanide to Richard in 1977, and he had given him detailed instructions on how to use it as a poison. And that is when Richard started going nuts with cyanide and other poison concoctions and becoming quite a little chemist. Hoffman was always around to answer Richard's questions. So, this Paul guy, he's a shady character. He's like helping Richard figure out innovative ways to murder people. He's not a good guy. Paul had planned to buy this very large amount of this drug from Richard at a very low price, and then he would resell it and make a huge profit. And this was supposed to be a very big drug deal. So Paul went to meet Richard at the warehouse, and during this deal, Paul showed Richard the $25,000 cash that he was carrying, and so Richard shot him under the chin and took the money for himself. And I will let Richard finish the story for you. Go ahead, Richard.
I put the gun under his chin, and I said, "There is no merchandise." And I shot him. He didn't die. The gun jammed. He was gurgling. I had hit him. It was, blood was pouring out of his mouth. And he was in I would imagine it looked like he was in a lot of pain. So there was a tire iron in there. I took the tire iron and hit him with it, which knocked him out. And he died. I then took him and put him in a 50-gallon drum, put it on the side of a motel. It was behind Harry's Corner. I listened to the people. I went in Harry's every morning. The thing was there for a long time. I looked at it every day. It was there. I went in Harry's every day. One day it was just missing. Continued to go in Harry's to see if anything was said about it. Nothing was said. I don't know what happened to the drum.
So this became yet another kill that Richard got away with. For now. Now, not long after that, Richard decided to pull together a crew of guys, his own little mafia, if you will, of all the guys who could never be made because they were not Italian. And these guys were Al Rinke, Gary Smith, Danny Deppner, and Percy House. Percy House, by the way, was Phil Salamini's brother-in-law, who, again, we will get to. They started this breaking and entering ring. They robbed houses, robbed trucks, you name it. They took it, they sold it. And according to Richard, they did well. But the amount of robberies caught the attention of the police, and by 1981, they began an official investigation. But Richard did not know this at the time. Now, one day, Richard came up with a plan to rob this other criminal guy that he knew named Louis Masgay. I don't know if it's Louis or Louis, but I'm going to say Louis. Now, Mazgay owned a variety store where he bought cheap stolen goods all the time and he would sell them in his store. And because of this, Mazgay was known for carrying around large amounts of cash, very large, making him the perfect target to rob. So Richard partnered with another of his friends, Phil Salamini, who I've mentioned a few times. So Richard lured Mazgay to Phil Salamini's store by telling him that he had some load of goods to sell to Mazgay. Then he and Phil shot Louis Mazgay and robbed him. He was carrying $90,000 cash with him, so this was a very successful robbery. After they killed Mazgay, they took the body and put him into an ice-cold well. Then they put a tire on top of that, and then a piece of plywood on top of that, and then they poured concrete on top of that. Another job well done. But things started to go south from there because it turns out that Richard should not have trusted Phil Salamini. Instead of keeping his mouth shut, Phil went bragging to the other B&E crew guys about his involvement in Mazgay's murder. What an idiot. And the breaking and entering boys hadn't known that Richard was a killer. This was not information that Richard had wanted them to know. And it wasn't long before the B&E boys were arrested for various other crimes. When that happened, Al Rinke was the first who decided to flip and become a police informant. And Al gave up everyone in the crew except Richard. He said he didn't know Richard's name, and I don't think that that's true. I think he did know Richard's name, but he knew that if he did give up Richard, he would die. Cool. Except then arrest warrants went out for the rest of the crew, and this Richard could not have because he knew these guys were weak and they would probably rat on him. So Richard rounded up Gary Smith and Danny Deppner. I don't know where Percy House was, but he was around. And he hid them in a motel room, convincing him that this was their best option. But Gary wound up disobeying Richard's orders when he left the motel to go visit his 5-year-old daughter. After this, Richard knew that Gary could not be trusted and that he had to go. So Richard came up with a plan. He went out, he picked up some burgers for everyone. What a guy. And after eating the burgers, Gary Smith began to get sick because Richard had laced his burger with cyanide. And he didn't die fast enough for Richard's liking, so he got Danny Deppner to strangle him to death with a cord. So now Danny Deppner was also a killer. Then they put Gary under the bed in the motel and they skedaddled. Multiple people then stayed in this hotel room before the body was discovered because the stench became too much. How horrific. Just think about that. That's disgusting. I think that happened there was another serial killer who did that. Was it the New York Times? No, what is it? Not New York Times. Times Square. The Times Square killer. Is that what his name was? The guy who killed sex workers in the Times Square. Is that a thing? Somebody was putting people under beds in hotels. Anyway, after this, Deppner seemed to be in Richard's good books, or at least he was now a part of the murder. So what was he going to do? Nothing. But Deppner had told one other person about this murder, and that was his wife. I believe her name was Barbara as well, but she could not hold it in. And the first opportunity she had to tell the police, she did that. And she was saying some pretty crazy things to the cops about this Richard Kuklinski. And at first they were, not really believing him, but then things that she was saying started to check out. The person that was found under the bed, that murder had already occurred, and she told them about it. And she got in pretty deep with that. And as Richard started to get word that people were talking about him, he decided that Danny needed to go. So Richard gave Danny a roast beef sandwich that was laced with cyanide. And when he ate it and began to die, Richard also decided to shoot him in the head, which it's like, why the cyanide if you're going to just shoot him in the head? Questionable. So to add to this situation, Merrick, Richard's daughter, had a new boyfriend named Richie. of all names. And Richard had grown to like this guy, Richie, which was interesting, unexpected a little bit. But slowly, Richard started to get Richie involved in some of his crimes, kind of unknowingly. And this was super sketchy. He got Richie to hide Danny in his apartment. Obviously, he didn't really understand what he was doing or why. And then once Danny was dead, he got Richie to help him get rid of the body. Which, again, another red flag here. Why do somebody who's gotten rid of bodies for years and years, why do you need help from a random teenager? That's weird, right? And he told Richie that this guy had like overdosed on drugs. Still super sketchy, but it seems like the reason that he obeyed or got involved was because like you just weren't going to say no to Richard because he's this huge, scary guy. Merrick knew that something was going on. She didn't know exactly what. But she got really scared and figured that it wouldn't be long before Richard didn't need Richie anymore and would maybe try to dispose of him. So she told Richie to just very quietly leave town and never come back. And he did. And that's probably what ended up saving his life. This whole scenario with all the killings with the cyanide and the food, that's what really got Richard on the police radar. That and Barbara's claims, and that is Barbara's claim. And especially because, you know, she's coming in claiming this thing, and then it's like all the witnesses are just starting to drop dead. And that's when law enforcement decided to really get serious about this guy. And we're going to get into the guy who really took Richard down in the next episode. He's a kind of interesting fella. But that is where I'm going to end things for now. Next week, I will be covering the investigation, Richard's takedown, and then everything that occurred after, including the notorious HBO Iceman confessions, Carlo's book, and all of the backlash and criticisms against those things or against what Richard had to say. There's a lot more to go. I'm pretty sure I can get all of it done in the next episode. I hope so. But please stay tuned because it's a lot. Yeah, and I think, like, hit me up if you think you notice some, like, stark differences between all the Mafia hits that, like, went seamlessly that Richard was involved in and the actual murders that that we have evidence that he actually committed. If you ask me, one group of those was a little sloppier than the other one, so I don't know. We will get into it. And thank you so much for listening. And if you made it this far, most people don't. So if you are one of the people who makes it to the end of the video, hey, that's awesome. You can reach out to me at hello@whosknockingpodcast.com. You can find me on Instagram, @whosknockingpodcast. And please stay safe out there because you never know who's knocking. This podcast is produced in collaboration with Lost Line Media. Artwork by August Digital. Music by Matthew Cook.